Aloha. My name is Marissa Machida, President of NAPABA Hawaii, and also with Bank of Hawaii. Thank you for joining us in part one of a two-part panel discussion featuring leaders from all sectors of our community on a conversation on race in Hawaii, history and current issues, and the future. We must respond. We hope these conversations will be insightful, educational, and inspirational, and are grateful for the support of many organizations. I'll go through them quickly for those of you just listening in. Mahalo to event sponsors, Japanese American Citizens League Honolulu, NAPABA Hawaii, ACLU of Hawaii, the Popolo Project, William S. Richardson School of Law, Muslim Association of Hawaii, We Are Oceania, Anthology Group, Bank of Hawaii, and to our community sponsors and supporters, Korean American Bar Association, Pacific Islander Law Association, African American Lawyers Association, Beta Beta Yama Foundation, Hawaii Friends of Civil Rights, Shining Islam's Light Across Humanity, Japanese Cultural Center of Hawaii, Matsunaga Institute for Peace and Conflict Resolution, Honolulu, Hawaii, NAACP, the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, Nisei Veterans Legacy, Vai Vai Collective, Hawaii Health and Harm Reduction Center, Hawaii Innocence Project, Native Hawaiian Bar Association, and the Hawaii Filipino Lawyers Association. As moderator for both panels, we are honored to have Noelani Kalipi. As president of Kalipi Enterprises, Noelani specializes in systems planning, food security, energy security, community empowerment, and helping communities to create and implement courageous space for difficult discussions. As Progression Energy, she leads the development of utility-scale renewable energy projects, specializing in floating offshore wind and solar energy. Noelani is active with the Hawaii Leadership Forum, Omidyar Fellows Program, and First Nations Futures Program. She gained extensive federal policy experience while working for U.S. Senator Daniel Akaka in Washington, D.C., and served on active duty in the United States Judge Advocate General Court. Noelani serves on the boards of PBS Hawaii, the Daniel Kahikini Akana Family Foundation, and Sustainable Energy Hawaii. She has a bachelor's degree in government politics and economics from George Mason University and a law degree from George Washington University National Law Center. Noelani, I'll turn it over to you.
I am honored to be the moderator for our session today. We appreciate how deep these issues are for so many of us, and how we have so many different perspectives about racism in Hawaii. This is a topic that many of us feel we should be talking about, yet we don't quite know how to do that. Why is that? Some of us would say it's about time. Others would say it's decades too late. Still others would say it's about justice. Let's just get with it. But one of the questions is, how might we address the inequities without perpetuating the system that has created it? For others, we have bias. How often have we heard there's no such thing as racism in Hawaii? How many times have we also heard, sure, we can do better, but we're not as bad as the mainland? Yet, what are we seeing on Hawaii's news, and what are we hearing our children say about others? Have we looked at our personal bias? Have we looked at the lens through which we look at different situations? Do we always search for the villain, the victim, and the hero? And how does that affect the way we see the world? How many of us have learned to live with the way things are just because that's the way it is in Hawaii? And how many of us benefit from it being that way? We are lucky to have a fantastic panel of experts with us this evening. Each panelist will have 7 minutes to share their mana'o, and then we'll jump into a question and answer session. And let me warn you right now, time is going to fly, and there'll be times when we will all feel uncomfortable, and that's okay. Let's lean into that discomfort. Let's marinate in that discomfort together for a while, so that we can genuinely begin to sense what might be going on, so that we can open our eyes, our ears, our hearts, and our minds to really see what people are experiencing, to really hear what they're saying, and to maybe even share what they're feeling. There's hurt, there's anger, there's fear, there's also love, and there's a desire to work collectively to make things better. Tonight's discussion is just one of the many steps that we'll take in what we hope will be a collective journey for us all to share. And one question I'd like us to think about is, what will Hawaii look like in 150 years? And what will our future residents say about us as their kupuna? Will they say, thank goodness they finally got it? Or will they still be asking, why? Tonight, we are joined by Sid Kanazawa from the National Asian Pacific American Bar Association, Dr. Candice Fujikani from the University of Hawaii at Manoa, Dr. Jonathan Osorio, Dean, Hawaii Nui Akea School of Hawaiian Knowledge, University of Hawaii at Manoa, Ms. Josie Howard from We Are Oceania, and Hakeem Wansafi from the Muslim Association of Hawaii. With that, let's get started. We're going to start with Josie Howard from We Are Oceania.
First of all, I would like to say thank you very much to the organizing uh, committee for this panel. I am very honored and humbled to be among these great leaders in Hawaii, to have the voice of our Micronesian community or Pacific Island community on this panel. Um, Second of all, I would like to acknowledge the I know I'm put in the place to speak first. And in looking at the panelists, I would like to acknowledge um, that I would like to express my utmost respect to the host culture, uh, the native Hawaiians, the culture of Hawaii, the spirit of this island itself, the ocean, the air that we breathe. Um, when I was asked to speak on this panel, I I was a little bit nervous, not a little bit. I was hell nervous because I don't know if I'm the right person to speak on the panel. And as the more I think about race in Hawaii, um, the more I reflect on my own experience as a Micronesian here in Hawaii and how that experience had brought me to this point. And so I chose to share um, a story that my grandmother always, my grandmother told me. To go to college, to go to high school, I have to leave my island, a small, very humble island with 200 people on the island, where life was simple. Everyone get along, everyone was related, and the cultural value was family, and the family was your everything. Family was your bank, family was your doctor, family was your social worker, family was your lawyer. Everything is within the family. So relationship is um, the key value that I grew up learning. So my grandmother, before I went off, she taught me to always treat others the way I want to be treated and always be kind. And she said, there's a time where it comes where you will wash up on somebody's shore and you'll become, an outsider, a salty feet. And salty feet means um, libresisit, which means salty feet. So being here in Hawaii, I feel very privileged. I feel very honored, and I'm always grateful to the Hawaii community. Um, to think about race in Hawaii, I think about my own experience in coming to Hawaii, not understanding what Hawaii was all about. I thought Hawaii was about, hula dancers. It was about nice beaches and Waikiki Beach. Not soon after I started my studies at UH Hilo that I learned there was more and there was a lot of similarities between my uh, Hawaiian friends with my own experience of growing up with USDA food, growing up with where my grandfather had to tell me stop eating that rice because finally you will follow the rice because rice doesn't grow on our island. I did not understand what he meant. Um, and he would always say, come here, let me teach you about the stars. Yeah, you go to school every day to learn about ABC, but first learn your stars and learn how to navigate before you go out there, because navigation is not just for the ocean, it's to navigate life. I'm very grateful to those values that were instilled in me, because that's what helped me to navigate these experiences, challenging experiences in here in Hawaii. But those challenging experiences had also taught me to look at myself. When I look at race, when I look at the challenges that Micronesian faces in Hawaii, um, I also look at my own. And there is this famous or a proverb in Chugis that says, Pope Senifar, if I want to make things change, if I want to make the way people think about me, it has to start from me. And I have to look within me first and see what are my biases. What are those things that I don't know that I need to know so that I can get along with the others who are in this community. I grew up in, like I said, a small community. Hawaii is a huge multi-community of different cultures. And I think even more, there's a need to uh, look within, to be aware of your own biases so that we can create a community that gets along, because we are so different. There's so many different beliefs, but the only way we can get along is by getting in touch with our heart and in with our being humans. Um, I was just reading a poem that I wrote in my feeling of being a human in and the title I put being a human at the wrong place at the wrong time. Being a Micronesian in the space we're at, I also felt that um, a lot of things happen to us without our choices. But that's what I think we experience when we talk about race and we talk about power and race and biases. And but the only way that we can dispel all of that, or because I know we can go on and on, um, talk about like how we've been discriminated. I myself can talk about that, but what good would that do if nothing can come out of it? And I think it takes the heart to make things change. It takes the heart. And I saw that through COVID. COVID was devastating in our community. Before COVID, the community was divided. But I feel that with our work with COVID, the community came together because COVID allowed us to go back to that place. And that place was our heart, where we care about our people, our neighbors, the people around us. Um, Sometimes we get so caught up in the system, in the standards, that we forget that these are just human beings. Their needs are real and their needs are unique to them, and that every one of us have that need. And I may be sitting here on this panel talking about race in Hawaii, but none of you knows what goes on, in my heart, in my head. So I think being a human, there's the universal need is to respect, is to, uh, you know, it's to be accepted. And yeah, that's my message about race in Hawaii.
Mahalo.
Thank
Thank
you.
you very much. And I apologize for the screen earlier. We were having some technical difficulties, so thankfully we can all see each other now. Dino Zorio. Sorry, you're on mute.
Thank you. Thank you, Nori. Velina Maika ke aloha. I want to thank not only the sponsors of this panel this evening. I really want to thank my fellow panelists because I know how this conversation is going to be difficult and awkward. We're speaking past each other. I hope you will see at the end of it that we are all talking about the same thing, even if we take different paths to get there. I've been thinking a lot about how we talk about things like racial healing, and I realized today that part of what we need to do is recognize where the hurt actually comes from and where the the problems that we face in this society, and not just in Hawaii, but in America and other parts of the world as well. So I put these thoughts together, and I may not get to the point where we can really talk about a solution or how the healing may take place. Um, so I hope I should just keep track of the time on the clock here. But I think that identifying what the problem is and has been in Hawaii is incredibly important. For me, the principal issue when you're talking about social difficulties and political difficulties is when you start to identify who gets to define what is natural and normal in a society, and how conflicts and differences are to be regulated and accommodated in that society. In some American states, for a very long time, Africans were treated as property. And in many states, Native people were viewed as brutal savages and their homelands subject to appropriation. In America, immigrants from different parts of Europe were often treated with disdain and earned the lowest wages, while immigrants from Asia could be abused almost at will. When we look at America struggling today with its racial problem, we need to be very clear about the origins of discrimination, the suppression of languages and cultures, and genocide. All of those things proceed from a very singular group of people. And it is that same group of people that we confronted here in Hawaii with the arrival of Europeans and Americans at the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century. And there was dispossession and racial discrimination took place in Hawaii. There is no question about that, historically, and especially in the early part of the 20th century. But it took a different path in Hawaii. And many people wonder what it is about Hawaii that makes us different. Why is there a measure of respect accorded to people who are different? Why do we seem to have fewer problems with immigrants? Why do we seem to be able to intermarry at a much larger, deeper rate than in other places in America over a long period of time? And I'm going to offer this analysis. In my opinion, so one of the things that you should know is that in the 20th century, there were numerous people who wrote about the emergence of this multi-ethnic society in Hawaii, right here at the University of Hawaii. Some of them were eugenics people like Stanley Porteous, who wrote about the sort of the rankings of human beings and how Caucasians were at the top, and black people were at the bottom, and Polynesians were somewhere near the bottom. And I'm not going to talk so much about that, but I will say that there was a genuine kind of feeling among many scholars that what was happening in Hawaii was really different from what was taking place outside of the territory in the United States. A much more conducive attitude toward racial difference and ethnic difference and intermarriage. And many of them said it was because of the Hawaiian culture and because of the aloha spirit. And a certain kind of myth building takes place in the 20th century about us as a people and how we paved the way for a more peaceful society here. My analysis is that it was the Hawaiian Kingdom government that protected the Kanaka and the immigrants to a large extent. Let's just look at the facts. I mean, from the very beginning of the kingdom, even before the kingdom was established by law, the chiefs demanded that the people be literate and required that men, women, and children all learn to read and write, and they paid for that public education. The governments paid for that public education, provided resources for it. So even as we were confronting European immigration here and the takeover of our lands and the use of our lands in the building of huge plantations, we actually had a people who were literate, informed. The kingdom provided that democratic form of government and liberally offered enfranchisement to all ethnicities. It wasn't just Europeans and Americans that were allowed to run for office and to become subjects and citizens. This was offered to people of any ethnicity, provided they could speak either English or Hawaiian, right? Provided they could speak the languages of the land and provided they followed the law. We provided translators in the courts and at the legislature in Chinese languages and in Japanese. So really the kingdom recognized from early on that it wasn't just the problem of the immigrant to learn our language, that they had to be accommodated. They had to have access to legal redress and to a fair treatment in the courts. And that could only be done with translators. We shared the division of land. The chiefs and the king shared the division of the land with all classes of the native people, and then provided inexpensive access to land right up to the end of the kingdom. We pursued relationships with other countries and not just European ones. Case in point was that Hawaii is the first country to recognize Japan as a nation state in the 1880s. The result of this was a relative balance in public discourse about race and policy in the 19th century, in the 1800s, with Hawaiians more than able to hold their own. We were aware of our talents and capabilities and critical of haole assumptions and arrogance. We were educated in our own language and in English and in other languages. We had a flourishing press and that published our histories, tales, song compositions, so that our culture was known and celebrated by our own people. And all that time, from the arrival of missionaries, we were confronting this formidable racist discourse from Americans and other Europeans attempting to position us as inferiors. Charles Stewart and Hiram Bingham making their incredible statements. Bingham wondering if we were really human. Charles Stewart wondering if we were the missing link between, the primate and actual human beings. The missionary class of people, basically missionaries themselves, former missionaries, and their children, really become a kind of business class of people here by the 1840s and 1850s. And their spokespeople, folks like E.O. Hall and Thomas Thrum, continually questioning the fitness of Hawaiians as leaders and as voters in our own country. The introduction of contract labor from China in the 1850s and continual complaints from the haole plantation owners about their character. The introduction of contract labor from Japan and continual complaints about their intentions. And then finally, I'm just really summarizing the kinds of things that we faced. Political leaders like Sereno Bishop and Lauren Thurston engaging in character assassinations of Kalakaua and Liliuokalani specifically in order to destabilize the government in the 1890s. With the takeover of our country by the missionary gang in 1893, the laws, policies, and resources of the kingdom turned almost fully into satisfying American needs and the needs of the haole plantation owners. Within 2 decades of the American takeover, Hawaiian political leaders are talking about how our people are losing our language, our discipline, our ambition, our connection to one another, our willingness even to go to school. By the 1930s, we are increasingly referred to as brutal, ignorant, criminal elements, social failures. And when Lawrence Fuchs wrote his famous book, Hawaii Pono, in 1960, it celebrated the rise of a mixed race of Asian, Caucasian, Asian and Caucasian movers and shakers as Hawaiian culture inevitably disappears. The miraculous, wondrous thing is that we did not and have not disappeared. Our resurgence is actually the key to the racial healing that so many wish to see happen, not only in Hawaii, but in America. As we have recovered our voice, our arts and sciences, our political will, we encourage all of those marginalized groups, the ones who have been oppressed and silenced, that there is a place of dignity and peace for them here. And it begins with the restoration of our political sovereignty and the restoration of the lands that were taken from our queen and from our government. So this is the last part of my message here. To break from a terribly disfigured and racist society, we need to restore the society that was healthy, welcoming, concerned about the poor in our midst, fair to the immigrant, and uninterested in world domination. And for America to follow that model, if we were to do that here in Hawaii, for America to follow that model, it would follow that it would need to restore to the people from whom lands were taken, the Cherokee, the Cheyenne, the Sioux, the Apache, their resources so that they are able, in a position to restore their culture to the dignity that it once knew. And it needs to make reparations to the descendants of slaves. And maybe it's not money, maybe it's free education all the way through college. Maybe it's also startup loans at low interest rates for their businesses. They need to equalize the vast inequities that they created through slavery and the taking of the lands of the native people. And as I sit here and offer that up as my understanding of what racial healing really means, it is more than talk. It is actual action, because the talk was never enough, and eventually will simply be seen to be an attempt to evade responsibility and a responsible reaction to the dispossession that took place. I believe it can be done, and I believe it can be done because you look at what we Hawaiians have done in this society. Our response to our dispossession and our marginalization in our own homeland has been completely peaceful. It has come with strong advocacy. Look at Mauna Kea, but it has also been welcoming to people of all ethnicities, regardless of where they come from, if and to the extent to which they recognize the justice of our claims. And I think
Mahalo.
that's enough.
Thank you so much. We now will hear from Candace. You're on mute. I'm not sure what's happening, Candace. How about, okay, let me try with Sid while you work that out. Would that be okay? Okay. Sid, can I ask you to please go and we'll work with Candace? Oh, you're on mute too, Sid.
We all kind of lolo in this thing, so
Okay.
sorry. I'm Sid Kanazawa. I was born and raised here in Hawaii. Went to the University of Hawaii. I was teaching elementary school in Waianae and Molokai, and then was an outreach counselor and a adult education teacher and body mechanic, and finally decided I need a full-time job, so I went to law school in Los Angeles. I've been away a long time, and in fact, I left when the Hawaiian Renaissance was just starting.
Okay, do I hear a playback?
And
Oh, sorry.
and I appreciate the comments of Josie and Dean Osorio. And I think that one of the things about being away is that you realize what you learned when you grew up here. And just as Josie was saying about what she learned from her upbringing from a small island, I think that all of us learn the same thing growing up on an island. That I think that when you're on an island, you realize that what goes around comes around, and that it is far better to make friends than to make enemies. And I think you also understand that things are not always going to be in your favor, and that sometimes you're going to be on the losing side of things. And if you're compassionate and kind when things are going well, then people are forgiving and compassionate to you when the tables are turned. And I think that that's the kind of lesson that Dean Osorio was talking about in terms of the compassionate leadership of the Hawaiian kingdom. But I think that there's more to it than that. And I think that the real reason that what I saw when I went to the mainland was that on the mainland, there is a real majority. It's whether depending on how you count, it's 60 to 75 or 80% of the population is considered white. And the minority groups are 25%. And if you break it down into the particular minority groups, it can be down to something like, 10%, 1%. So it's all these little small pieces. And it's different when you are in that kind of context than when you're in Hawaii, where there is no majority group, where we are a majority minority group. And so in order to get things done, you have to get together with other people to get things done. And one of the things I loved about growing up in Hawaii is that you could fight like hell with people and disagree, but people understood that we're all in this together. And so sometimes we disagree, and sometimes we have to agree and go in a different direction, and we're forgiving in that respect. And I think that that's the one thing that we have that brings us together. And for me, I never lived in the kingdom and don't know what it was like back then. But for me, the concept of local is what captures that feeling of we're all in this together and we're all together. And that feeling of local means that you don't have to be Hawaiian. You don't have to be born in Hawaii. You can identify with this group by your feelings about each other, respect, empathy, and understanding of other people. And I think that that's what we can teach the rest of the country. Because when you're in a majority, true majority, and a minority, you think differently. And sometimes you get stuck thinking with the group that you're with, right? For me, that came during the Vietnam protests. And I remember marching against the war. And I remember being surrounded by people who thought just like me. And I thought the whole world thought like me, because everybody around me was thinking just like me. And then the election came, and Nixon won every single state, including Hawaii. Every single state. I think the Democrats won one or two, But I looked at that and I thought, wow, I am so out of sync with the entire country. I got to learn a little bit more. I got to listen a little bit more. I got to find a way to identify with everybody else so that we can build better coalitions going forward. That's what I learned.
Mahalo for sharing. Candace, have you been,
Yeah,
you fixed
can you
yours?
hear
Okay,
me? Can
yes.
you hear me? Okay, awesomeness. Okay, thank you. So, aloha mai kako. My name is Candace Fujikane, and I'm an English professor at the University of Hawaii. So, I've been teaching at UH for 26 years. I'm Yonsei, so fourth generation in Hawaii. And the two key points I kind of wanted to bring up today is one, that as Asians, we are settlers in Hawaii, that we do not have the genealogical connection to Hawaii that Anupunahele have. And that raises the question, what is our kuleana as settlers? Second, I have a hopeful message that as Asians, we have a choice. We can either be colonial settlers or we can be settler allies, even settler aloha aina, meaning that as Asians, we can support Hawaiian lands and waters, and we can support Hawaiian independence. Okay, so what I'm asking people to think about is that we occupy simultaneous positionalities. We are always being oppressed and oppressing others at the same time. And I think that that's the difficulty that Asians in Hawaii have in terms of thinking about race, because Asians think about our oppression on the plantations or the internment of Japanese or even the anti-Asian racist violence that we see happening today, right? But at the same time that we have been subjected to these racist practices and we've been subjected to discrimination, we have also participated in a settler colonial kind of occupation of Hawaii. We have participated in the dispossession of Native Hawaiians. And we can see evidence of this if we look at the state legislature. What is the composition of the state legislature today? The body that makes legislative laws in Hawaii, right? Laws, decisions, policy decisions. 65% of the state legislature is Asian. 40% of the state legislature is Japanese. But Japanese only make up 20% of the general population. How is it that as Japanese we are doubly represented in the state legislature? It has to do with the fact that so many teachers in the Department of Education are Japanese. So my mother was a teacher, my husband's a teacher. And I say this not to be divisive. We're not being divisive between Japanese or and Hawaiians or between Asians and Hawaiians. What we're asking is those of us doing this kind of work is for Asians to question how does the state legislature stand against Native Hawaiians? And the best example of that would be Mauna Wakea. So what's happening on Mauna Kea? What we saw there were kupuna in wheelchairs, in walkers, yeah, who were facing off against state officers carrying tear gas and sound cannons. How did we come to that in Hawaii? How did we come to a point where 38 kupuna and their kapo'o were arrested? They were led to these paddy wagons. They were carried, they were pushed in their wheelchairs. And many of us who were standing by, we were crying when we witnessed that sacrifice. They told us to stand back because they wanted to stand and make a statement that this is what the state of Hawaii does to kupuna who stand for Mauna Wakea. And John Osorio, he was on the front lines too. And even though he has a very distinguished title as the Dean of the Hawaiian School of Knowledge, on the front lines, he is a kupuna. And he was as vulnerable as all of the rest of them. And that's what was striking to me was John's vulnerability on that front line, because they wanted to protect the younger generations. So this problem of how is it that the state or that people in Hawaii don't respect Hawaiians' argument, their belief, their understanding of Mauna Kea as sacred. I can give you lots of legal reasons why the TMT should not be there, but I shouldn't even have to go there because on the at the very front line of anything is the fact that Hawaiians see Mauna Kea as sacred. Therefore, there should be no construction on Mauna Kea. And those of us who are settler aloha aina, there were very many of us, Koreans, Japanese, whites, we were settler allies. We were standing with Kanaka Maoli because we too believe that Mauna Kea is sacred. Now, I don't say this to be angry, or to make people feel bad. But like you said, we need to marinate in this question of why Hawaiians' respect for Mauna Kea is not respected by the rest of the population in Hawaii. Why is it that politicians were saying we need to follow the law? Now let's look at the law. The state Supreme Court argued that Hawaiians never proved that Mauna Kea, that religious practices were practiced on the site of the TMT. But where the TMT stands is in the middle of 263 altars and shrines. How is that not a secret place? So we see that our laws are faulty. And so when politicians say we need to follow the law, it's part of our heritage that standing up for civil rights was standing against unjust laws, right? Standing against the internment of Japanese Americans, that law was unjust. So that, we have to ask these questions. Now, we can be settler aloha aina. We can stand with Kanaka Maoli. We have a choice in all of this. And the term Asian settler came from Haulani K. Trask's work. And it's been carried on for the past 21 years. The word first came out in a book we published in 2000. So for 21 years, the term settler, Asian settler, has been around. And in books like A Nation Rising, Noelani Goodyear Kaupua, she talks about settlers in Hawaii, but she looks at settler allies and our potential as allies. So there's a lot of other things I want to talk about, like how we can move towards a decolonial and an abolitionist future, that Asian settler aloha aina stand with Blacks, we stand with Muslims, we stand with queer, non-binary gendered, trans communities, we stand with the poor, it is actually a solidarity movement. So anyway, that's my thing. Thank you.
Mahalo, Candice. Hakeem?
Hello, everyone. Certainly a pleasure to be amongst you and to have this opportunity to speak about this important topic. It's a pleasure to see everyone. Let me first start by saying that I believe that there is no racism in the US, but only if you are not Black, you're not a Muslim, not an Asian, not a minority, not a refugee, not a person with an accent like myself, not poor or homeless. But if you are part of any of these categories, you have experienced either blatant or subtle form of discrimination. This only leaves the rich white folks, but they too will tell you that they have been discriminated against through affirmative action and other policies that were put in place to try to help balance the scales. As a person born in Morocco, technically making me an African American, speaking Arabic, which makes me an Arab, practicing Islam, which makes me a Muslim, a person with an accent. I have many stories to share about personal discrimination against me and people like me. But what disturbs me even more is when the person discriminating against us are many times themselves minorities who are discriminated against by other groups. Some would say that racists and bigots increased in numbers in most recent years, but I believe that racism hasn't increased. It's always existed. However, it was convincingly highlighted during the last administration, which encouraged most of the bigots and racists to come out of their closets, almost as if they were given permission to act on their deepest, darkest hatred of others that do not necessarily look like them. But today, I don't want to enumerate these racist acts committed by individuals or by some groups. I think my time will probably be a little bit better spent speaking about institutional racism, a major root cause that seems to shape many of us with ideologies and other subtleties delivered to our TVs, to our handheld phones, through news media, social media, and through policies of the government and other institutions. One institutional racism that I want to highlight today is in my area of expertise, which is housing. The current discrimination against an entire population, such as the homeless, such as those who have subsidized housing, it's still legal. You just have to go to Craigslist and you will see advertised no Section 8 accepted. And when trying to build an affordable housing development, such as the public housing development or any affordable housing development, much of the public come out in complete opposition. Why? I believe that we've been conditioned to associate such housing with those poor people, uneducated, and many other inaccuracies and perceptions that cause neighborhoods and communities to conclude that ultimately these types of housing initiatives increase crime in my neighborhood and affect my property value. Experts will tell you that the decades-old government housing policies have had a lasting negative effect and impact on American society, resulting even today in a stagnant and racist inequality. There can be no questions that members of disadvantaged groups have had a hard time finding a high quality place to live in a high opportunity neighborhood. It still happens today. The truth is that segregation in every metropolitan area was imposed by racially explicit federal, state, and local policies, but were hidden under what the Supreme Court called now and what is generally known and accepted as de facto segregation, something that just happened by accident or by individual choices. But that myth, which is widespread across the political spectrum, hobbles our ability to remedy and solve discrimination and racisms that have done and continues to do enormous harm to our country and to our state. It goes back to the history of public housing, something that I was not aware of until a couple of years after I started as the executive director of the Hawaii Public Housing Authority. As you may know, public housing began in this country for civilians during what was referred to as the New Deal. And it was an attempt to address housing shortage. It wasn't a welfare program for the poor people. In 1933, faced with a housing shortage, the federal government began a program explicitly designed to increase and segregate America's housing stock. In his book, The Color of Law, Rothstein said it correctly and said it accurately that housing programs began under the New Deal were synonymous with the state-sponsored system of segregation and separation. The government's efforts were primarily designed to provide housing to whites, middle class, and lower middle class families, while African Americans and other minorities were left out of the new suburban communities and were pushed instead into urban housing projects. Even the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, which was established in 1934, they furthered the racist segregation efforts by refusing to insure mortgages that are near minority neighborhoods in the infamous policy known as redlining, which is a color-coded map designed to indicate where it's safe to insure mortgages. However, locations that were near where African Americans and minorities lived were colored in red to indicate to the appraisers that these neighborhoods were too risky to insure. At the same time, the FHA, same entity, was subsidizing builders who were mass producing entire subdivisions for whites with the requirement that none of the homes can be sold to a minority or to a Black person. Even the 1968 Fair Housing Act was an empty promise because those homes were no longer affordable to the families that could have afforded them when the whites were buying into those suburbs and gaining the equity and wealth that followed from that. The FHA issued a program to suburbanize America and subsidize the white families who were living in the white housing project, as well as the whites who were living elsewhere in the central city to move out of the central cities and into these white-only suburbs that were sponsored and built by developers. This resulted in white projects having large numbers of vacancies, whereas the Black projects had extremely long waiting lists. Eventually, it became so noticeable that the public housing authorities and the federal government opened the white designated projects to African Americans and minorities, which were quickly filled. But at the same time, industries and jobs were leaving the cities, and African Americans and minorities were becoming poorer in these areas. The projects became projects for the poor people, not for working class as they were designed initially. They became subsidized where they had not been subsidized before. They became the projects that we now picture as landlords when a housing applicant reveals to us that they are recipient of a public housing voucher. In theory, these vouchers holders can move anywhere they can find a willing landlord to rent to them. But in practice, many vouchers gets returned to us because they couldn't find somebody to rent a place for them. In practice, their housing choices are severely constrained and significantly dependent on the landlord, who are influenced by their perceptions and prejudices against the poor people, racial and ethnic minorities, and those trying to come out of homelessness. Imagine a homeless person knocking on your door to rent because they have a Section 8. Just that first glimpse make you determine that this is not a person I want, and not thinking twice about it, refusing to serve that person and provide housing, although he or she going to pay the same amount. But there is a glimpse of hope. 2 days ago only, on June 15, 2021, JP Morgan Chase called on, and for the first time, outlined legislation to fight appraisal bias, finally back in the 2018 Booking Institution study that found that homes in majority Black and minority neighborhoods are valued 23% less than those same houses with few or no minority residents. I'll stop at here because my time is limited, but in summary, we need to talk about and investigate institutional racism conveyed through government policies or promoted by media outlets, as much as we should investigate and address individual acts of racism. Thank you very much for this time.
Thank you. That was powerful and tied it all together. So thank you, Hakeem. We have time probably for half a question, but we'll go ahead and go and start with that. I think the thread that we've been hearing overarchingly through all of this has been the concept of us versus them, right? And the perceptions of whether there's a good group or a bad group, or whether this group has a right to make decisions or the other. And I think in terms of the context, I want to ask the panel, are inequities and experiences that we're talking about focused more on race and ethnicity and justified by race and ethnicity, or are they driven by power and access, as Hakeem had talked about in terms of policies, or is it a combination of both? And if so, um, you know, what is it within the system that allows us to have these discussions, to be able to recognize it, and yet the status quo snaps back like a rubber band, right? So again, is it an issue of race and ethnicity? Is it an issue of power and access? Is it a combination? And what about that helps to perpetuate what we've been talking about as systemic racism?
I think it's all of that. But I think that the solution is the narratives that we want to tell ourselves going forward. That the fact that we came here because of narratives that have brought us to this point in time doesn't mean that those narratives have to continue. And what it means is that there, well, let me step back one step. Under our system, there is a perception that there is one truth, that there is one truth, one way, one God. But in reality, we rarely get there. That 98% of the cases were settled and there was no one truth. And even the cases go to trial, we have DNA evidence that we got it wrong. So it's not like there is magic. We're imperfect. We're trying to create a more perfect system. But what we can do, and I think what island people understand, and is that we got to live together. You don't have the choice of getting off the island. You gotta be here, and all that. And if you are gonna live together, you got to figure out how to listen to each other and to try to figure out what we're going to do today for tomorrow. How we got here is instructive, but it doesn't define what we're going to do from this point forward. We have to decide that. And we have to do it by listening to each other, respecting each other, empathizing with each other, and being kind to each other.
Thank you, Sid. Josie?
I do agree with Mr. Kanazawa that it is all. And I think, like, for me, I think about power, and I think about also related to what Hakim said. I mean, we cannot deny that the truth of the world we live in, that there's a dominant paradigm. I was confused for a long time. I did not understand why certain things were considered better than certain things. Like, for example, simple as white skin versus dark skin, dark hair versus ehu hair. Those, like, how we define beauty, how we define all of that. And when I learned about dominant paradigm, it became all clear to me, and it almost like hopeless, because I realized the truth that no matter what, there's gonna be them and there's gonna be us. And the creation of us and the other, the Orient and the West, right? It does play out. I mean, and it does play out in wars until today, right? And so that's why I think it's really up to people that are empowered today to use that power, either to use it to gain or to use it to unite. And to unite is, that we include everyone. There's a need to, even though we are a small number of people in a small, or come from a small part of the world, small islands, we still matter because we are human beings, right? And I think when we get to that point where we realize that we are human beings and that each of us should be honored for who we are and honored for the way we think and the way we believe, and that our common value is, respect, humility, love, and all of that, I think that's when we can come to be able to heal with this, with racism and the discrimination experiences that we experience, or we come to solve that problem within our society. Um, Other than that, I mean, I think it's going to continue because that's the truth. And our islands show that in nature, there's the bad side of the island and there's the good side, right? And it's up to us to make that decision whether we're going to use the power to benefit everyone and to honor everyone. Thank you. And that's true with policies where everyone is included, not just for certain people. And I totally agree with Hakim on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Dean Osorio?
I'm having trouble because I don't disagree with either Sydney or Jocelyn. The the way a society treats its poorest, its least, the people who have who come later, who don't speak your language, who need the help, is probably the measure of how good a society that is. And America has essentially done a very different kind of thing when it comes to dealing with access. It has basically taken from some, it's enslaved others. It has created enormous opportunities for people, not necessarily only white people, but it has created privilege for groups of people and has pretty much said, for the rest of those who failed or died or were dispossessed, that's in the past. And for us to say today that we can actually heal a society that is based on that kind of fundamental theft by not doing any redress strikes me as completely unrealistic. At the same time, I really do honor the feelings of wanting to be at peace with each other. I honor the sense that we, all of us here in this panel, regardless of our ethnicity, our ancestry, our religious beliefs, our sexual preferences, that all of us are entitled to dignity. And I believe that a society needs to protect that and honor that and not set us against one another. And I do think that the society that we have lived in, there have been too many opportunities where government or business or whatever was wanted by the powerful, they were more than willing to set us against each other. So how do you fix it? I think we start by the assumption that we are in this together. But then we need to start holding people accountable, and governments and institutions. Like Hakim says, we need to start holding them accountable.
Thank you. Candice?
Yeah, so, I think this is not just about race, but also about indigeneity. Indigeneity is a separate category. So, Kanaka Maoli have rights that the rest of us do not have, guaranteed by Article 12, Section 7 of the Hawaii State Constitution, that their rights to practice are guaranteed. None of us who are Japanese or Chinese or Filipino have that particular protection of rights. Also, Public Law 103-150, the US Apology Bill, recognized that Hawaiians never gave up their rights to the lands, the crown and government lands that were seized at the time of the overthrow. Now, these lands, these 1.8 million acres of lands, now the state legislature is trying to extend leases on those lands for 100 years. That's more than a generation. Now, these are specifically targeting indigenous or aboriginal peoples. There's a controversy over whether you should call Kanaka Maoli indigenous or aboriginal, but it's a separate category than the racial category that the rest of us who fight for our civil rights are involved in. Kanaka Maoli are fighting for human rights, the rights to their lands, the rights to their practices, the rights to their sovereignty. I'm not fighting for my sovereignty as a Japanese person in Hawaii. There's a question in the chat that asks, how do I deal with the fact that I benefit as a professor from all this funding? Now, the thing is that I was hired as an Asian Americanist. So I was not hired as a Hawaiian literature specialist. I was hired as an Asian Americanist. So I teach courses in Asian American literature, but I also teach courses in Hawaii literature. So, and I want to say that those of us who are settler Aloha Aina, we get arrested. Okay, we stand on the front lines. We stand against the tear gas. We stand against the sound cannons. That's what it means to be a settler Aloha Aina. So I just wanted to clarify that whatever profits I get, I try to turn back to the Kanaka community. So I get money for stuff like for my book. It goes to the artists in my book. My books are places where I can provide a space for Kanaka Maoli practitioners to speak, because otherwise they wouldn't have a place. One more thing I want to bring up, Board of Land and Natural Resources. They deliberately selected someone who is not Kanaka Maoli to be their Hawaiian cultural expert. That is what power and privilege looks like in a settler colonial society.
Yeah.
Mahalo. Hakeem?
It's always difficult to say anything after esteemed colleague that spoke, but I think it's all the above. We must adopt what the Alcoholic Anonymous do. We have to admit, number one, that there is a problem. And we have to define that problem. I think you ask 10 people what racism is, you're probably going to have 10 different answers from the same 10 people. You'll find people from the same family that have completely opposing views against this group of people or against that group of people. I think until we at least define and be honest with each other and stand and say, I'm racist, and define how am I racist and what do I need to do? And I'm saying that because oftentimes it's very subtle. We don't even feel it until it's gone, until it passed by you, an opportunity. And sometimes our prejudices and what we have learned make us view anyone who's looking at us as if that person is actually also racist or not. So I think to be able to really address the issue is, we know there is racism. We just need to define it and make really steps. And those steps, I guarantee you, will include legislation. It will include enforcing just some of the laws. As I've mentioned, there's so many laws that's supposed to protect us, but they are not really protecting us. So I think looking at all of that. But in general, I'm a firm believer that people are inherently very good people. There are some fringe, there are some people who are not, and we find them in the Muslim community, you find them in Asian community, you find them in all the communities. Inherently, we are good people. We just need to get to a place that we can define what racism is. And number two, we have to agree that we don't have to agree with each other so long as we respect our views and work as a family. I don't agree with my wife all the time because she'll always win the argument anyway. But at least we respect, we listen to each other and respect each other. So I'll just stop at that.
Thank you. When we were asked to do this panel, the idea was to start exercising the muscle to have these conversations, to start creating the space to share the diversity in perspectives. And I thank all of the attendees for staying 8 minutes over. It's almost an impossible task to talk about something like this in 60 minutes. So thank you to all of the panelists for making my job as your moderator much easier by sticking to the times that we had previously agreed to. Thank you to all of the attendees for all of your questions that are in the live chat. And thank you to the sponsors for having the courage to put this discussion on. We will be having a second panel as well later in July, but I especially want to mahalo all of the panelists for sharing your deep mana'o and being able to lean in. And I look forward to continuing this collective journey with all